Pywell, and it's just been told that it's now recording. So my name is Beth Pywell. I'm the chair of Women in Planning West Midlands, of our West Midlands branch. I took over the role in September from Mandy, who did a stellar job last year. And I'm being supported by my vice chair, who's Rose Sanger at Addison Young, and also by our amazing committee. If you want to find out a little bit more information about Women in Planning, you can do so from our website or following us on social media. We're available on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. For those of you that don't know anything about Women in Planning, I'm sure some of you do, as you're here with us today. But really at a high level, Women in Planning is an independent network, and our aim is to promote a diverse, equitable and inclusive planning industry. We believe women should feel empowered when working in the planning industry. And whilst Women in Planning is female-led, it is open to all. And it was really great to see on the sign-up sheet that we had a real range of attendees who had signed up today. We have a number of events coming up in the next couple of months. We are quite active as a West Midlands branch. We try and put on an event at least once or twice a month. Our next event after today is our Green Spaces walking tour next week. This is in association with the National Trust and is sponsored by Field Fisher. This is fully booked, but we are operating on a waiting list system. So if you are interested, please do put your name forward. Next month, we have a legal update with King's Chambers. This is sponsored by King's Chambers and will be hosted at CBRE, and that will be an in-person event. And lastly, we are planning a Christmas event in December, and we're just finalising details and dates for that now, and we will be in touch in due course. Again, if you want to find out any information, please do sign up to our mailing list and you'll be the first to know. I would now like to thank Wright Hassell for sponsoring our webinar today, and also particularly to Rebecca for her efforts in organising today's event and also in speaking and presenting today. It is greatly appreciated. So to introduce Rebecca, she's not only an associate planning solicitor with Wright Hassell, but is also a member of the West Midlands Women in Planning Committee. In her role with Wright Hassell, Rebecca regularly acts for a variety of clients, including local planning authorities, housing associations, landowners and developers, and advises on all areas of planning law, both contentious and non, and highways related matters. She was recently described in Legal 500 as someone who cares about what she does and is technically very good. And knowing her personally, I know that is very true. Today, Rebecca is going to talk us through a practical guide to affordable housing provisions in a Section 106 agreement. Now, if you do have any questions, please can you put these forward in the Q&A box as we go through. Rebecca will then answer these. Additionally, she'll later be joined by her colleague Leslie, who she'll introduce in a bit more detail later, but they will both be able to respond to any questions that you might have on the topic. So thank you again, Rebecca, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Beth. An afternoon, everybody. Hopefully I've successfully unmuted myself. Yes, affordable housing, a practical guide to Section 106 agreements. So here at our Hassell, as Beth has said, we regularly act for housing associations, developers, local authorities. And when considering today's talk, it occurred to me the number of times we were approached by all those different organisations in order to rectify matters within planning documents, which could easily have been avoided had the original agreement been drafted differently. I understand all parties interested in residential development. The key goal is to secure the planning permission as quickly as possible in order to realise the development and help to deliver much needed affordable homes in this, which are vital in the midst of this current housing crisis. Whilst everybody wants to progress the 106 agreement quickly, it is critical that the affordable housing provisions are drafted in a practical and workable way, and wherever possible, making them future-proof. Whilst repeatedly dealing with deeds of variation can be lucrative for solicitors, it only causes delay and expense for developers and housing associations. So whilst I don't want to do myself out of a job, I wanted to discuss today some drafting measures for affordable housing provisions to minimise the need for subsequent variations. The first point, and one that many housing associations have made to me, is that if at all possible, let your preferred affordable housing provider, if you have one, have sight of the agreement at the draft stage. This ensures the affordable housing provisions work for them. This enables them to input any general or site-specific issues into the process before the agreement is finalised. When that isn't possible, however, what kind of issues should we be thinking about when negotiating a draft with the council? Well, anything that can create a delay to charging units, for example, an insufficient mortgage exclusion clause, or anything that will cause delays in occupation or selling the units, for example, onerous marketing provisions. So the logical place to start then is with how the provision of affordable housing is captured. And in most cases, this will be by agreement, but sometimes it's done by the imposition of a condition requiring an affordable housing scheme to be submitted prior to the commencement of development. So what is better for developers and housing associations? So whilst the condition might result in a quicker planning permission because it avoids all the pre-contract negotiations, capturing the affordable housing by way of a condition doesn't capture the adequate detail to govern the affordable housing provisions, including the appropriate mortgage exclusion clause. I'll come on to the importance of those clauses later, but it's important to say here that dealing with affordable housing by condition can result in uncertainty until the affordable housing scheme has finally been approved and implemented. Including the provision of affordable housing within a 106 agreement is, in my view, the better way to secure the balance of flexibility with detail. Of course, the level of detail you include in your 106 agreement will also be influenced by whether you're dealing with a full or outline consent. For example, it's unlikely to be desirable to include specific numbers of units and dwelling types in securing overall dwelling numbers will not be, because the overall dwelling numbers won't be certain when you're looking at an outline condition. More flexibility will be required in relation to an outline. And it's better to deal with percentages rather than specific numbers here, such as tenure splits left to a scheme to be submitted at a later stage. But you can still ensure that you input all the specific important terms, such as the mortgage exclusion clause. Of course, all of this may be informed whether you've got an affordable housing provider on board. If you have one on board, the provisions can be more tailored. If not, then it's best to leave them wider to allow the housing association to work with them when they do come on board. So how do we build that flexibility into the 106 agreement? Do we want to tie the affordable housing definitions down to the time they were drafted, or allow them to adapt with changing policy, legislation and guidance, which we all know is fast moving? Some developments will take years to commence and the housing needs will change over time. And in general terms, we need to build flexibility into the agreement. For example, many agreements will stipulate a split between tenures, 70% affordable rented, 30% shared ownership. It may transpire upon approaching an RP or indeed marketing those units that there is less need for one of those tenures or a difference in the split which needs to be tweaked, or even the introduction of a new tenure. So for example, we need to think about how we include scope for other tenures to be provided, or whether the definition of affordable housing should refer to the latest iteration of the National Planning Policy Framework, such that it can accommodate the introduction of new forms of affordable housing. Next, are the eligibility criteria future-proof? Will the local parishes have been stipulated in the local connection still exist or be appropriate in years to come? Many councils are also now stipulating that affordable units may not be occupied by those with an income of £80,000 or more. With the current rate of inflation, this is unlikely to be sustainable, and it's necessary to consider whether an increase or a review mechanism is required. Sometimes, if specific wording or formal review mechanisms can't be agreed, a tailpiece to those provisions along the lines of unless otherwise agreed with the council in writing will usually avoid the need to enter into a deed of variation. All that will be required is written evidence from the council that they are agreeable to the revised proposal. Even better, if we couple that with a corresponding boilerplate clause to the effect that their consent required under the agreement is not unreasonably withheld or delayed, this gives the council comfort that it retains adequate control without providing the developer or housing association with a clear route to achieving a variation without a formal deed. The recent case of Stonewater and Wealdon District Council did highlight the need to include flexibility into drafting 106 agreements. And in this case, 35% of the dwellings were to be provided as affordable housing. Under the Planning Commission and the 106 agreement, but Stonewater applied for social housing relief from the Community Infrastructure Levy on 100% of the dwellings in the development. The council determined that not all the dwellings were eligible for the relief, as only 35% were designated as affordable housing under the agreement. Therefore, anything over 35% was an over-provision and unlawful. The council took the position that there was not sufficient evidence that the over-provision would be provided as affordable housing, as they weren't designated in the agreement and bound therein. The court agreed with the council's approach and provided the council was entitled to have regard to the fixed provision of 35% in the 106 agreement as a relevant consideration when considering social housing relief. Given the rather unsatisfactory outcome of that case, we need to consider the drafting around percentages carefully. We need to use words such as at least or as a minimum to ensure that we don't create a cap or a level of the affordable housing to be provided. It needs to allow an over provision. Moving on to charging, housing associations will often want to charge their stock to enable them to raise further funds to deliver additional affordable housing. And there are a number of points within a planning document that can either render the properties unchargeable or lower the value significantly. One specific issue with capturing affordable housing by way of condition is the inability to include that all-important mortgage exclusion clause. Whilst it's acknowledged that local planning authorities want to rightly safeguard and preserve affordable housing in perpetuity, the council's fear of the risk of a lender of a defaulting housing association selling properties free from the restrictions in the agreement has led to housing associations not being able to capitalise on their stock to enable reinvestment. These clauses can come in a couple of forms. First, a mortgage exclusion that completely excludes the mortgagee from the terms of the agreement, so it will not be binding on them at all. Second form is a conditional mortgage exclusion. This will set out a process which is to be followed by the lender before they can sell the properties unencumbered from the terms of the agreement. The ideal and best scenario is to obtain an absolute mortgage exclusion, but more likely the likely outcome is that the conditional mortgage exclusion will be obtained. The National Housing Federation set up a working group, of which we at Hassel are on the panel. One of the aims was to agree this standard clause to benefit housing association funders, regulators and local authorities in the housing sector. As a result, the standard National Housing Federation mortgage exclusion clause was born. If incorporated into the 106 in its exact form, as shown on the screen, it would allow registered providers to charge their properties at the much higher value of market value subject to tenancy, otherwise known as MVSTT. There are a number of key points in the clause which are highlighted in red, from ensuring all guises of a lender are incorporated to ensuring that the lender can, after 3 months, dispose freely from the restrictions in the 106 agreement. Any tweaking of the standard clause is not recommended, as it's been agreed by the sector as one that balances the risk as low as it is and satisfying a lender that they can, if required, get their money back quickly. A non-standard clause could reduce the value of the properties to an existing use value, otherwise known as EUV. So what impact does that have in real terms? Well, it will impact heavily on what the housing association has to spend going forward on affordable housing. An EUV valuation is around 30% of open market value, as opposed to an MVSTT valuation, which is 60%. You can see there's a significant difference there. And looking at a real life example based on a 2020 valuation, a 4-bedroom property in Wiltshire can differ in value by £70,000. It's worth noting that shared ownership property will only ever be valued on an EUV basis, depending on the level of equity owned by the occupier. There is, however, still some resistance to these clauses from some local planning authorities, but the risk for them in not agreeing an acceptable clause or a developer not pushing for one may result in the housing association deciding not to take homes in that area because they can't charge properties sufficiently to allow further reinvestment in affordable housing. The inclusion of the mortgage exclusion in a suitable form is often overlooked at the outset if the housing association is not involved. And whilst the amendment of the mortgage exclusion to make it acceptable for charging purposes can be overcome by a deed of variation. This is on the basis the council is agreeable to the amendment. If they are agreeable, there can be lengthy delays in getting the variation in place. We all know that the council's resources are stretched, and there is also the added legal costs of dealing with the matter, depending on the number of parties involved. I've one at present that's actually taken me 18 months to get to the point where we don't even have an agreed document as yet, given that the amendment is so simple. Another point which is slightly off point is, but also affects charging, is evidence. When putting a sales pack together, it's always useful to include evidence from the council that the obligations in the 106 agreement have been complied with. The housing association will need this when putting their properties into charge, and without it, it could reduce the value of the properties on any future charging exercise. Obtaining it after the event can be difficult. So what sort of affordable housing provisions does a 106 agreement contain that can cause delays to occupation of the affordable housing units? Well, often they contain requirements that the affordable housing can only be occupied by people with a local connection, so a local connection criteria. In the first instance, this usually means that properties have to be offered to someone within the parish of a property, and they can be very restrictive if they are not drafted widely enough. The clause on screen represents a very widely drafted local connection criteria clause, which allows the housing association to move from very local marketing and allocation, for example, the parish of the property, to adjacent parishes, moving on to the district of the property, and then to anyone in the UK, but on the proviso that the person in question is in need of affordable housing. Now, whilst it is beneficial that the local connection moves out as widely as possible, it's also important to ensure that the time frame the housing association is expected to market to each level is workable and doesn't take too long. Cumulatively, the marketing to each level can cause significant delays in getting people into the properties and leaving costly voids for the housing associations. Some councils deal with the marketing period within the 106 agreement itself, and others deal by way of a separate document or a document to be agreed between the parties at a later date. On the screen is an example of a document which is to be appended to a 106 agreement and sets out the timescales for moving through the marketing requirements. So you'll see week 1 and 2, they are to market to a qualifying person within the parish. Week 3 and 4, if no one's found, move to adjacent parishes. Week 5 through to 8, this is to people within the district of the property. Most of our clients like the drafting to allow for the whole process to take no longer than 8 weeks. And the aim for housing associations is always to ensure the marketing requirements are clear and can be worked through in a time period which minimises the time that a property is empty. We spoke there about documents being appended to a 106 agreement to deal with marketing of properties. It's always important, however, to be careful of separate external documents that are referred to in a 106 agreement. Do we know what they contain? Do we know what their implications are? Documents such as local lettings plans, nominations agreements, and council policies can often be referred to in the draft and not appended. You should make sure that if this is the case, the documents are contained and considered to ensure that we know how they affect the housing association going forward. Additionally, does the 106 agreement refer to them as being current policy in place at the time they come into play, or at the time the 106 agreement is drafted? If they're to be the current at the relevant time, the housing association may be signing up to conditions that are unknown. Having stated that 106 agreements are preferable for affordable housing because of the ability to be specific and clear, housing associations will also have other regimes, documents and requirements they need to comply with alongside a 106 agreement. And a 106 agreement could stray into areas already governed by these documents and regimes. So it's important that these different requirements don't conflict with each other and create inconsistencies. The first example I've put on screen is grant funding criteria. The government's affordable housing programme provides grant funding to support the capital costs of developing new affordable homes, and housing associations utilise the grant funding if they are utilising it, sorry, for funding, you need to ensure that the 106 agreement doesn't offend any of the application criteria. The first one on the slide there is local connection criteria, which can preclude grant funding if applied to shared ownership units. In our experience, most councils will now agree to some form of words which exclude the shared ownership units from the local connection requirements, whilst still retaining it for social or affordable rented units. Second on screen is the initial percentage of equity purchased on shared ownership units. The previous grant application criteria required a minimum initial purchase of 25% of the equity. The new Affordable Homes Programme criteria for 21 to 26 is 10%, allowing 1% increments. New 106 agreements are increasingly showing the change, but there are still many old agreements around affecting units coming forward that include the local connection criteria and the old 25% requirement. It's helpful to keep definitions sufficiently wide to allow for such change over time. For example, as you can see on screen, the preferred clause would be shared ownership dwelling shall be provided on the basis that an initial share, no percentage prescribed, based on the open market value is purchased with rent paid on the remainder. This allows that change over time. Okay, so another regime to be mindful of is DPAs. Some developments will fall within what are known as designated protected areas. This is an area that would not otherwise get plan permission for housing, but for the affordable housing being provided in perpetuity. If the affordable housing is located within the DPA, they will be required to use the Homes England Model Area Protected Lease. This ensures that the relevant clauses are included to preserve the property for shared ownership indefinitely. There are two ways in which they can be safeguarded indefinitely: mandatory buyback or restricted staircasing. Use of either one of the options will mean that the units won't be released out onto the open market in an area where the types of housing are difficult to replace. Mandatory buyback allows a purchaser to staircase to 100%, but requires the housing association to buy it back if they wish to sell and they own more than 80%. This can impact on a housing association's cash flow, as they won't know when they're required to buy these properties back. Restricted staircasing, however, usually prohibits a purchaser from retaining more than 80% of the units, and if they wish to sell, the landlord has the first option to buy back. If the landlord doesn't purchase or doesn't find another purchaser within a specified time, the owner can sell their share on the open market, but subject to the eligibility criteria. Lenders do prefer the mandatory buyback regime over restricted staircasing, as it provides them with more control and certainty if they have to step in when selling the units. This means it's easier for the housing association's purchasers to obtain a mortgage for properties subject to the mandatory buyback. If the properties are not within a DPA area, they are not obliged to use the protected area lease. Despite this, a 106 agreement may expressly require the use of a model lease or state that the units are subject to restricted staircasing and/or a mandatory buyback. If the property is not within a DPA, definitions and clauses within the agreement should be checked carefully for such restrictions, such as that one as highlighted red on the screen. We do advise using the model lease wherever possible to ensure consistency and to guard against a lender changing their requirements and the housing association finding themselves with leases that don't meet those requirements. Finally, in relation to other documents and regimes, the 106 can create inconsistencies with the shared ownership lease used by housing association is one big one. For example, in relation to time periods for disposal of a shared ownership unit, if matters are governed by the lease, then they should be left out of the 106 document, preferably entirely, to avoid conflicts and inconsistencies between the two. There should be a general clause in the 106 agreement requiring that disposal is to be in accordance with the terms of the model lease, rather than the more prescriptive clause shown on screen, which is open to conflict. If the local planning authority is insistent in including these provisions, it's advisable to add in a caveat to the 106 to note that if there are inconsistencies between the two documents, so the shared ownership lease and the agreement, that the lease shall prevail. So, an all-important part of a 106 agreement is ensuring the relevant absolute exclusions from liability are included. Who should be excluded from the obligations in the agreement? Well, they're listed there on the screen as plot purchasers and occupiers, that is, of affordable and market units. Anyone who staircased their shared ownership to 100%. An occupier of a social or affordable rent unit who has exercised a right to buy, right to acquire, or the right to shared ownership. Registered providers and statutory undertakers. It's also important to ensure that the successors and mortgages are included within that exclusion. The parties listed in bold on screen are often wrapped up in what's called a protected tenant definition. And once those parties have exercised their rights in respect of the properties, the agreement needs to make clear they're no longer subject to the affordable housing restrictions and provide them with an absolute exclusion from those provisions and terms. I'm noticing that some councils are looking to exclude the voluntary right to buy from the definition of a protected tenant. And whilst the voluntary right to buy scheme is somewhat dormant at present, because the existing pilots have expired, in May 2022, the Conservative government stated that they have plans to extend the scheme. So there is scope for it coming back into focus. We therefore need to ensure that agreements allow everybody who exercises that right to then be unencumbered by the terms of the 106 agreement. Going back to the right to shared ownership, this is a new concept that's been brought about by the conditions attached to affordable housing, the Grant Affordable Housing Programme 21-26 for social and affordable rented homes. It allows tenants of those homes to purchase shares in their home on shared ownership terms to help them get on the property ladder. The 106 agreement needs to be drafted to allow a route out from them being bound by the provisions in a similar way to other protected tenants. So on screen is a full exclusion clause including all those parties and a protected tenant. The housing associations will want to ensure that sufficient exclusions are included to ensure that they are not required to comply with the terms of the 106, so contributions, for example. That is save for relevant use and occupation criteria for the affordable housing units, which obviously they should rightly be bound by. And whilst many of the developers will, in the course of contract negotiations, provide the housing association with an indemnity against the developer, against any action taken by the council for the developer's default, if the developer were to disappear for whatever reason, then that indemnity disappears with them and leaves the housing association without protection. The ideal scenario is to have the protection incorporated into the 106 agreement itself, although some councils are reluctant to include this, and the scenario here would be just a commercial risk for the housing association to consider. The same concept is true for a housing association plot purchaser, and the inclusion of an absolute exclusion for such purchasers would be a great idea, and it would mean that they don't need to worry about obtaining evidence to satisfy themselves that the obligations have been complied with when they acquire. If the plot purchasers were not excluded, then solicitors would be looking to the housing association to provide them with an indemnity in the event of default in a similar manner as they've obtained from the developer. So finally, there will be some clauses which can cause a housing association an administrative burden. And often 106 agreements will include provisions to put in place a management company to maintain and look after the public open spaces and communal facilities. It's important to ensure that these service charge arrangements dovetail with the housing association's own procedures. Definitions in this regard need to include the ability for housing associations to be a member of the management company rather than their affordable housing plot purchasers or occupiers. There's less concern around shared ownership purchasers being members, although from an administrative perspective, it's preferable to leave them out also. Many housing associations now like to see a service charge cap to ensure that the units stay affordable, because the addition of an open-ended service charge can start to affect the affordability of the units. Planning agreements often have many notification requirements contained within it to ensure the council is notified at certain points along the development, and these often relate to triggers for the compliance of obligations within it. One standard notification clause, which is often overlooked, is the change in ownership clause. In its standard form, it requires the owner to notify the council of any change in the ownership of the site. But firstly, which owner needs to notify the council? Is it the outgoing owner or the new? when does the requirement end? It would be beneficial to make clear in these clauses when the notice is to be provided. So, for example, within 7 working days from completion of the change. This will then inform who gives the notice to the council. If it's to be given after the change, it will be the new owner's obligation. The clause also usually states that this notice is to be given on each occasion until all the obligations have been complied with. There will be many obligations, such as affordable housing, that will be ongoing in perpetuity, and the clause will remain in force. It's wise to ensure these clauses include an exclusion for individual plot sales, and that way the housing association will not be required to inform the council every time they sell a plot. So, in summary, we need to ensure we get the housing associations on board early, make sure we get the compromise between detail and flexibility correct, depending on the type of permission that we're looking at and whether we've got the housing association on board. We also need to ensure there's sufficient mortgage exclusion clause in order to make sure we can maximise value. We need to ensure all references to external documents and policies are known. And we need to make sure that other documents regulating the properties don't conflict with the agreement. And finally, ensure that those sufficient protections are in place from exclusion from liability in the agreement. So, I hope that's been useful. It was a whistle-stop tour of some of the key points that I know some of our housing association clients, things that we regularly deal with and regularly crop up on a regular basis. So let's check whether we've got any questions. Okay, so one that's popped up is, can a mortgage exclusion clause be included in a planning condition? Well, whilst I haven't included mortgage exclusion clause in a condition, I haven't seen one before put in a condition. There isn't a legal reason why that can't be included in one. But given the length of the standard clause, it would make a condition very unwieldy. So it's probably not advisable. I have previously been involved in a Section 73 application to vary a condition to include a mortgagee exclusion clause within the affordable housing condition, but because it was going to be unwieldy and wordy, we decided to opt to put it in the affordable housing schedule, affordable housing scheme that was being submitted and agreed. Instead, I still would suggest, however, this is less than satisfactory, and it would be better kept in the 106 agreement itself. Yeah. Anything else? So, what if the development is 100% market housing, but there is ultimately an intention to provide the whole site, 100% market and intention to provide it as affordable? Well, we come across this on a regular basis with our housing association clients developing out whole sites for themselves. Firstly, I would make sure that discussions are being undertaken with the local planning authority to flush out any issues, especially around community infrastructure levy and social housing relief, given the Stonewater case. And because of that case, I'd make sure the agreement doesn't include any restrictions for market housing being provided as something else. And lastly, I'd make sure the agreement doesn't include anything that precludes the use of grant funding, because obviously this is often utilised by RPs to purchase such sites. I don't think there is any other questions. I have got Leslie on board with me today here. She's from one of our housing association clients at Homes Plus, who's on standby to answer any practical questions from the housing association perspective. But I don't know whether I've stunned you all into silence, but there isn't many questions coming through. But if you have any, do please pop them in the chat. Otherwise, feel free to use my details on screen to send them through.
That's great. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for your time today. It's really appreciated. And thank you everyone for your questions. As Rebecca said, if you do have any more, feel free to get in touch with her details on the screen. So we'll probably be ending the event there now, but thank you again to everybody involved in the preparation for today. And as I said, please do subscribe to the Women in Planning mailing list, or follow us on social media so you can see our upcoming events over the next 2 or 3 months. So thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, Beth.